Church gatherings in the past looked nothing like they do today. After-service socials were filled with more than faith. They were brimming with delicious foods. Let me introduce you to the forgotten church recipes from the 60s that no one makes anymore. The 1960s church potluck table had a way of turning the simplest ingredients into a meal fit for a crowd. Among the lineup of casseroles and molded salads sat a dish that never failed to surprise. Savory, hearty, and unexpectedly delicious. It was a time when home cooks made do with what they had, and for many that meant Bolognia and eggs. These were pantry staples, cheap, filling, and always available. When combined into a baked pie, they transformed into something greater than the sum of their parts. Church recipe books from the era frequently featured variations of egg-based pies, often stretching just a few ingredients to feed an entire family. Bologna, once considered a working-class protein, was a common substitute for pricier meats. Mixed with eggs, cheese, and a flaky crust, it became a surprisingly satisfying meal. Some versions even included a dollop of mustard or a splash of Worcestershire sauce to punch up the flavor. As tastes changed and processed meats lost popularity, dishes like this began fading into history. Today, fried bologna has made a nostalgic comeback in diners, but the pie? Not so much. Perhaps it's time for a revival, maybe with fresh herbs, real ham, or even a gourmet twist. Cornmeal, bacon, and a little creativity. Sometimes that's all it took to turn a Southern classic into something fit for a church potluck. Hush puppies had long been a staple of fish fries and barbecue joints, but in the 1960s, home cooks found a way to bring that crispy, golden flavor to the potluck table, without the deep fryer. Enter the Hush Puppy Casserole, all the familiar flavors of the beloved side dish, baked into a rich, spoonable delight. Fried hush puppies were best eaten fresh, but a casserole could be baked ahead of time, making it the perfect choice for after-service luncheons. The recipe was simple: cornbread batter, bacon, onion, and sometimes a handful of cheese for extra indulgence. No hot oil to worry about, no last-minute frying, just mix, bake, and serve. While hush puppies have stood the test of time, their casserole cousin faded away as lighter, fresher options took over the potluck circuit. Bacon and cheese-laden dishes lost ground to salads and vegetable trays. But with Southern comfort food making a comeback, this forgotten gem might deserve a second look. A touch of smoked paprika, a sprinkle of fresh herbs. Who says tradition can't have a modern upgrade? Gravy is a sacred part of Southern cooking, rich, comforting, and usually savory. But in the 1960s, some church kitchens took a different approach, crafting a version that leaned sweet rather than salty. Raisin Gravy was a surprising addition to the potluck table, poured generously over warm biscuits. While it might sound unusual today, this dish had deep roots in the South, where home cooks made the most of what they had, often stretching ingredients into unexpected new creations. The base was simple: flour, butter, and milk, thickened to the right consistency. But instead of sausage or drippings, cooks stirred in raisins for a burst of sweetness, sometimes adding a splash of vinegar or a pinch of cinnamon to balance the flavors. It was a thrifty way to elevate an everyday meal into something special, often served at Sunday suppers or during revival gatherings. By the late 20th century, as sugar became more abundant, fruit-based gravies lost their appeal. The rise of boxed pancake syrups and fruit preserves made sweet sauces easier to come by, pushing raisin gravy into obscurity. Yet, with the modern appreciation for heritage recipes, it might be time for a comeback. Scarcity has always been the mother of invention in the kitchen. During the Great Depression, when meat was expensive and every pantry item had to stretch, cooks turned to flour, tomatoes, and a little ingenuity to keep their families fed. By the 1960s, some of those frugal Depression-era dishes still lingered in church cookbooks, including one that combined two unlikely elements: soft, pillowy dumplings swimming in a sweet tomato sauce. At first glance, it may have looked like a dish in search of an identity. Was it a main course, a side, or even a dessert? The answer depended on who made it. Some cooks thickened the sauce with sugar and butter, giving it a candied quality, while others leaned savory with onions and a pinch of black pepper. The dumplings themselves were simple: flour, milk, baking powder, sometimes a little egg, dropped directly into the bubbling sauce to cook through. Over time, as grocery store shelves became fuller and palates changed, the idea of tomato-sweetened dumplings fell out of favor. Today, it's hard to find anyone who still makes them, but considering how tomato-based dishes like shakshuka and butter chicken have gained popularity, maybe it's time for a revival. Long before America had chocolate chip cookies and boxed cake mixes, early kitchens relied on simple, fruit-based desserts to satisfy a sweet tooth. One of the oldest and most beloved was a light, creamy dish that turned tart gooseberries into something truly special. Dating back to medieval England, this dessert made its way to the American colonies, where it remained popular for generations, especially in church gatherings. The recipe couldn't have been simpler: stewed gooseberries, lightly sweetened, folded into rich cream or custard. Some versions thickened the mixture with breadcrumbs or egg yolks, while others let the berries shine on their own. It was a dessert of contrasts: tangy yet sweet, rich yet refreshing, and one that required no fancy ingredients. In the 1960s, it was still holding on to its place at church socials, tucked between gelatin molds and pies. So why did it disappear? The decline of gooseberries in American home gardens played a big role. Once common, the fruit fell out of favor due to agricultural restrictions and changing tastes. Meanwhile, instant puddings and canned fruit cocktails took over the dessert scene. Among the more distinctive dishes to grace church gatherings was a plate of pickled pig's feet, a delicacy that balanced bold flavors with time-honored tradition. This was a real testament to thrift and preservation. Pickling allowed communities to store meat without refrigeration, ensuring nothing went to waste. The process was straightforward. Pig's feet were boiled until tender, then soaked in a brine of vinegar, salt, and spices. Some recipes added sugar for a touch of sweetness, while others leaned heavily on black pepper, garlic, or red pepper flakes for heat. After a few days in the jar, the result was tangy, gelatinous, and intensely flavorful, a true Southern staple. For decades, this dish held a firm place at church picnics and family reunions, often served cold alongside cornbread and greens. But as processed foods and fast meals took over, dishes requiring days of patience and an adventurous palate started disappearing. Today, pickled pig's feet are mostly found in specialty markets, their legacy preserved by a handful of die-hard traditionalists. Could they make a comeback? Well, if bone broth can be trendy, who's to say pickled pork can't follow? Some vegetables never quite escape their reputation. The rutabaga, a humble root often mistaken for a turnip, spent much of its history as survival food, cheap, abundant, and a reliable staple during hard times. But in the 1960s, church cooks had a way of dressing up even the most overlooked ingredients, and in the right hands, rutabaga transformed from rustic to refined. A soufflé might seem like an ambitious choice for a potluck, but this dish was surprisingly forgiving. The preparation was simple: boiled rutabaga mashed until smooth, combined with eggs, butter, and a touch of sugar, then baked until light and airy. The result was a velvety, slightly sweet dish with a golden crust, far from the bland boiled roots that some tried to avoid. For Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, this was a way to make an everyday vegetable feel special. As the years went on, however, soufflés of all kinds started disappearing from American tables. The rise of casseroles, quick breads, and instant side dishes made delicate baked dishes seem like too much effort. But with modern food trends celebrating farm-to-table produce and vintage recipes, the rutabaga soufflé might just be ready for a comeback. Few dishes stretched $1 quite like slow-cooked cabbage. Affordable, filling, and easy to prepare, it was a mainstay of Depression-era kitchens, and by the 1960s, it still held a place of honor at Sunday dinners and church potlucks. With just a few simple ingredients, home cooks could transform a plain head of cabbage into something deeply flavorful, proving that good food didn't have to be expensive. The secret was low and slow cooking. Sliced cabbage was simmered down with onions, garlic, and plenty of butter or bacon grease. Some versions added a splash of vinegar or a pinch of sugar to balance the flavors, while others relied on black pepper and a dash of red pepper flakes for warmth. The result was tender, silky cabbage with rich, savory depth, perfect alongside cornbread or served over rice. For decades, this dish was a kitchen essential, but as lighter, fresher meals became the norm, slow-braised vegetables fell out of favor. The rise of steamed, stir-fried, and raw cabbage dishes left smothered cabbage in the past. With today's renewed appreciation for comfort food and heritage recipes, it's no surprise that more home cooks are rediscovering its simple pleasures. The right condiment can elevate a meal, and in 1960s church kitchens, a well-crafted chutney was a treasured staple. It was about creating harmony. If a dish was too sweet, a touch of tartness provided contrast. If it felt too rich, a bit of spice added intrigue. Among them all, Cranberry Chutney stood out for its remarkable versatility. Unlike the smooth, jellied cranberry sauce that became a holiday staple, this chutney had texture and bold personality. Whole cranberries were simmered with sugar, vinegar, and warm spices like cinnamon and cloves. Some recipes included diced apples for extra sweetness, while others added a handful of raisins or even a splash of citrus juice. It was served alongside ham, turkey, or even a simple biscuit, adding just the right amount of tang and depth to any dish. So, what happened? The rise of convenience foods pushed homemade condiments aside. Canned cranberry sauce became the standard, and the idea of simmering a pot of chutney from scratch seemed like too much effort. But with modern palates embracing bold flavors and artisanal spreads, maybe it's time for a chutney revival. For generations, hominy was a kitchen staple, humble, hearty, and steeped in tradition. Made from dried corn that had been soaked and hulled, it had a chewy texture and a mild, nutty flavor that made it perfect for casseroles. By the 1960s, hominy bakes were a familiar sight at church potlucks, nestled right between the macaroni salads and baked beans. This dish was all about simplicity and comfort. Hominy was combined with butter, cheese, and eggs, then baked until golden and slightly puffed. Some variations added a sprinkle of paprika for color, while others mixed in green chilies or crumbled sausage for extra flavor. The result was a casserole that was rich yet delicate, creamy yet slightly chewy, a true standout among vintage side dishes. But as time went on, hominy fell out of favor. Corn in its whole kernel form became the go-to choice, and canned hominy was often seen as outdated. Meanwhile, rice and pasta-based casseroles became more popular, pushing hominy bakes further into obscurity. Yet today, with Southern and heirloom recipes regaining appreciation, hominy is making a quiet return. Its unique texture and mild flavor make it a perfect canvas for modern twists, because some traditions are just worth reviving. For decades, home canning was a seasonal ritual in American kitchens, and among the rows of pickles and preserves, there was often a jar of something deep red, vibrant, and unmistakable: beet relish. Sweet yet tangy, with just the right amount of bite, this old-fashioned condiment was a staple at church potlucks and holiday dinners, adding color and flavor to otherwise simple meals. Beets were an easy crop to grow, and preserving them meant they could be enjoyed well beyond harvest season. The relish itself was a blend of cooked grated beets, vinegar, sugar, and a generous spoonful of horseradish. That last ingredient gave it a slight kick, making it the perfect companion for roast meats, sandwiches, or even a dollop over cottage cheese. A pairing that might raise eyebrows today, but was once a Midwestern favorite. So why did this once popular spread fade into obscurity? Blame the shift towards store-bought condiments. As ketchup, mustard, and mayonnaise became the default sandwich toppings, beet relish was slowly left behind. But as more home cooks rediscover small-batch preserving and bold farm-fresh flavors, this forgotten favorite is showing signs of a comeback. In the days before supermarkets neatly packaged boneless cuts of meat, nothing went to waste. Gizzards, livers, and other organ meats were just as valuable as steaks or roasts, especially in southern kitchens where resourceful cooks turned them into something truly satisfying. Among the most beloved of these dishes was gizzards and rice, a meal that, when done right, was rich, hearty, and full of slow-cooked flavor. The key was patience. Gizzards, the tough, muscular part of a chicken's digestive system, required long, slow simmering to become tender. They were first boiled with onions, garlic, and bay leaves, allowing the flavors to develop. Once softened, they were chopped and folded into a well-seasoned pot of rice, sometimes with a splash of broth or a bit of butter to add richness. Some cooks spice things up with paprika, black pepper, or even a pinch of cayenne for extra warmth. For generations, this was a go-to dish for church suppers and family gatherings, but as convenience foods took over, fewer people took the time to prepare organ meats. Today, however, the growing interest in nose-to-tail eating and heritage cooking is putting gizzards back on the menu. For centuries, rhubarb was a sign of spring, a tart, sturdy stalk that thrived in backyard gardens and found its way into pies, jams, and old-fashioned desserts. Among them was the Rhubarb Fool, a dish so simple yet so satisfying that it endured for generations. Light, tangy, and folded into billowy whipped cream, it was a reminder that dessert didn't need to be complicated to be delicious. The process required only a handful of ingredients. Chopped rhubarb was gently stewed with sugar and sometimes a splash of orange juice, softening into a thick, rosy-colored compote. Once cooled, it was swirled into freshly whipped cream, creating a dessert that was both refreshing and indulgent. Some cooks added a touch of vanilla or even a dash of nutmeg, while others layered it with crumbled biscuits or cake for extra texture. Despite its appeal, Rhubarb Fool faded from church cookbooks as modern desserts became more elaborate. The rise of packaged pudding mixes, boxed cakes, and instant treats pushed this simple classic into obscurity. With today's renewed love for farm-to-table ingredients and heritage recipes, Rhubarb Fool might just be due for a revival. Walk into any church basement potluck in the 1960s, and you'd likely spot a dish that was as vibrant as it was unmistakable. Hard-boiled eggs, stained deep magenta, bobbing in a jar of pickled beets. Sweet, tangy, and packed with a sharp vinegar punch, this old-fashioned favorite was both a conversation starter and a cherished tradition. The method was straightforward. Sliced beets and peeled hard-boiled eggs were soaked in a mixture of vinegar, sugar, and pickling spices, often with cloves, cinnamon, or black peppercorns to round out the flavor. After a few days, the eggs took on their striking color and absorbed just enough of the brine to develop a mildly sweet yet tart bite. Served chilled, they were a staple at Easter gatherings, church luncheons, and even as a side to sandwiches or meatloaf. But as the decades passed, home pickling declined, and beets themselves lost favor in many kitchens. Jars of mayonnaise-based salads took over potluck tables, and the patience required for a multi-day pickling process no longer fit modern lifestyles. Today, however, as fermented and pickled foods make a resurgence, these ruby-hued eggs might just find their way back. Long before plant-based eating became a trend, certain church communities were already perfecting vegetarian cooking. Among them were Seventh-day Adventists, known for their focus on wholesome, meat-free meals. Their solution to the Sunday potluck classic? A cottage cheese loaf, a dish that looked like meatloaf but delivered its own distinct, hearty flavor. The recipe was a blend of practicality and creativity. Cottage cheese provided protein, while eggs, breadcrumbs, and seasonings bound everything together. Some versions included chopped nuts for texture, while others leaned on onions, celery, and soy sauce for depth. Once baked, it held its shape like traditional meatloaf but had a lighter, slightly creamy bite. Often served with gravy or tomato sauce, it was a staple in Adventist gatherings, where it became a beloved part of fellowship meals. As the decades went on, however, this dish faded from mainstream church cookbooks. Meat substitutes became more accessible, and the idea of using cottage cheese as a base for a loaf seemed old-fashioned. But with the renewed interest in high-protein vegetarian comfort foods, this forgotten gem might just be ready for a comeback. Few vegetables have had a tougher reputation than the turnip. Once a kitchen staple, it was often dismissed as too bitter, too bland, or just too old-fashioned. But in mid-century church kitchens, home cooks found a way to transform it into something unexpectedly light, creamy, and subtly sweet, a dish known as Turnup Puff. This wasn't the boiled and forgotten turnip of wartime rations. Instead, the root vegetable was mashed until smooth, blended with eggs, butter, and a touch of sugar, then whipped into a fluffy mixture. A golden, buttery breadcrumb topping provided just the right contrast, a delicate crunch over the soft, pillowy base. Some cooks added nutmeg or cinnamon for warmth, giving the dish an almost dessert-like quality, while others kept it simple, letting the natural sweetness of the turnip shine. For decades, Turnup Puff held a place in church potlucks and Thanksgiving spreads, but as diets shifted, so did the spotlight. Mashed potatoes became the default side dish, and turnips were left behind in favor of more familiar flavors. But today, with the resurgence of farm-to-table eating and heritage recipes, it might just be time for a comeback. After all, if cauliflower can be turned into pizza crust, surely turnips deserve another chance at greatness. Long before fast food fish sandwiches and frozen fillets, haddock was a staple in home kitchens, particularly in church communities where fish-based meals were common for Friday suppers and Lenten gatherings. For families looking to stretch their grocery budgets, this dish was a resourceful and satisfying solution, combining flaky haddock with creamy mashed potatoes to create a simple yet comforting bake. The process was straightforward but effective. Haddock was poached in milk until tender, then flaked and folded into mashed potatoes, eggs, and a touch of butter. Some cooks added a sprinkle of grated cheese or a dash of mustard for extra flavor. The mixture was then baked until golden and puffed, creating a light but hearty dish that paired well with vegetables or a side of homemade biscuits. It was humble, wholesome, and effortlessly filling, a church potluck favorite for decades. As convenience foods took over, the idea of baking a fish-based casserole from scratch fell by the wayside. Frozen fish sticks replaced fresh fillets, and boxed instant potatoes became more common than the real thing. There was a time when no church potluck, Sunday dinner, or holiday spread felt complete without a warm dish of sweet corn pudding. Creamy, rich, and lightly sweetened, it struck the perfect balance between savory side dish and indulgent comfort food. Simple, yet deeply satisfying, it was a recipe that brought generations together at the dinner table. At its core, the dish was a testament to humble ingredients. Fresh or canned corn was blended with milk, eggs, sugar, and butter, then baked until it formed a golden, custard-like consistency. Some versions leaned sweeter, adding a dash of vanilla or a sprinkle of nutmeg, while others embraced a more savory twist with a pinch of black pepper or even a handful of grated cheese. No matter the variation, the result was warm, spoonable perfection, a dish that felt like home. So why did it fade from church menus? As tastes modernized, boxed cornbread and quick mixes became the standard, replacing slow-baked, hand-stirred dishes. Yet, with the resurgence of classic comfort foods and farm-to-table cooking, corn pudding is quietly making a comeback. Once a cherished staple of church bake sales, holiday tables, and ladies' luncheons, date nut bread was a recipe that combined simplicity with deep, rich flavor. It was a time when a well-made quick bread could stand in for dessert, a coffee companion, or even a light breakfast. Warm, slightly sweet, and packed with earthy dates and crunchy walnuts, it was a loaf that felt both indulgent and wholesome. The preparation was as straightforward as it was timeless. Chopped dates were softened in hot water, bringing out their natural caramel-like sweetness. Mixed with flour, eggs, butter, and baking soda, the batter came together quickly, with walnuts folded in for extra texture. Once baked, the loaf had a deep brown crust and a moist, tender crumb, making it the perfect pairing for a slather of cream cheese or a drizzle of honey. So why did this once popular bread fade away? As store-bought pastries and pre-packaged snacks took over, homemade quick breads lost their spot on the kitchen counter. But with today's renewed appreciation for old-fashioned baking and natural sweetness, there's no reason this classic can't return. After all, when a recipe has been passed down for generations, maybe it's worth dusting off the mixing bowl and giving it another go. Baked custards once held a special place on the church supper table. They were simple, dependable, and didn't require fancy ingredients. Among them, Grape Nut Custard stood out, a creamy, subtly sweet dessert with a hearty, whole-grain texture. It wasn't flashy, but it was comforting, a dish that felt as familiar as an old hymn. The magic started with humble pantry staples. Eggs, milk, sugar, and vanilla were whisked together, forming a rich base. Then came the secret ingredient, grape nuts cereal. When stirred in, the tiny nuggets softened as they baked, settling into a slightly chewy layer at the bottom while the custard firmed up on top. Some versions added a pinch of nutmeg or cinnamon, enhancing its warmth, while others served it chilled with a dollop of whipped cream. Though beloved in New England and among frugal home cooks, Grape Nut Custard gradually faded. As dessert trends shifted toward lighter, airier treats, the idea of a baked, grain-heavy custard seemed less appealing. Yet, as today's food lovers rediscover retro comfort foods and nutrient-dense ingredients, perhaps this old favorite is due for a second chance. Because if chia pudding and overnight oats can have their moment, maybe a little grape nut custard deserves one too. Once a common root vegetable, salsifi has all but vanished from modern kitchens. Known as the oyster plant for its subtle, briny flavor, it was a prized ingredient in early American cooking. By the 1960s, it was still holding on in church kitchens and rural pantries, often making its way into creamy, baked casseroles that stretched simple ingredients into something satisfying. The process started with scrubbing and peeling the long, slender roots, revealing a white interior that turned soft and tender when cooked. Once boiled, it took on a delicate texture, almost like asparagus meets parsnip. In casserole form, it was often combined with butter, cream, breadcrumbs, and sometimes a sprinkle of nutmeg or parmesan to enhance its flavor. Some recipes added eggs for structure, while others leaned on cheese for richness. The result was a dish both humble and refined, rich in flavor yet light enough to serve alongside heavier entrees. As grocery store produce aisles filled with easier-to-grow, more recognizable vegetables, salsifi lost its place at the table. Many home cooks had never even heard of it, let alone cooked with it. There was a time when every church bake sale, holiday gathering, and Sunday coffee hour had at least one plate of molasses crackle cookies. Soft, chewy, and richly spiced, they were a comforting reminder of home-baked goodness. Unlike the crisp snap of a gingerbread cookie, these were tender with just the right balance of sweetness and spice, a humble yet deeply satisfying treat. The secret to their signature crackle top came from a simple process. A dough made from molasses, brown sugar, butter, and warming spices like cinnamon, ginger, and cloves was rolled into balls, coated in granulated sugar, and baked just long enough for the surface to set while the inside stayed soft. The result was a delicate balance of crisp edges and a melt-in-your-mouth center. Some bakers added a pinch of black pepper for depth, while others swore by a splash of coffee to enhance the molasses flavor. So why did these once popular cookies start disappearing? As prepackaged snacks filled grocery store aisles, home-baked treats became less common. But with today's movement toward nostalgic, from-scratch baking, molasses crackles are poised for a comeback. For centuries, herring was a lifeline in European kitchens. Affordable, easy to preserve, and packed with nutrients, it became a staple in Scandinavian, German, and Eastern European communities, many of which brought their culinary traditions to church potlucks and community gatherings in America. Among them was herring salad, a dish that blended bold flavors with a surprisingly delicate texture. The preparation was both simple and resourceful. Pickled or salted herring was chopped and mixed with boiled potatoes, onions, and sometimes apples or beets, creating a dish that was salty, sweet, and tangy all at once. Some recipes added a touch of sour cream or mayonnaise for richness, while others kept it light with just vinegar and mustard. Served cold, it was a refreshing contrast to the heavier casseroles and roasts that dominated church dinners. So why did it fade from modern tables? As American palates shifted toward milder, less fish-forward flavors, dishes like herring salad became relics of the past. The rise of convenience foods and prepackaged deli salads only accelerated its decline. There was a time when no church potluck or family picnic was complete without at least one pastel-colored, marshmallow-filled salad. Among them, Watergate salad reigned supreme, a light, sweet, and oddly named dish that found its way onto countless tables in the 1970s. Its origins lies in a marketing creation, not a family secret. The recipe first appeared in the mid-20th century, coinciding with the release of instant pistachio pudding mix. The combination was oddly irresistible, a mix of pudding, crushed pineapple, whipped topping, and miniature marshmallows, often with a handful of chopped nuts for crunch. It wasn't a salad in any traditional sense, but that didn't stop it from becoming a staple at church gatherings and backyard cookouts. Yet, as tastes evolved and health-conscious eating took over, Watergate salad fell out of favor. The rise of fresh fruit salads, Greek yogurt parfaits, and lighter desserts pushed aside the whipped, topping-heavy confections of the past. But while it may not grace as many tables today, it's far from extinct. You'll still find it at the occasional potluck, nestled between the baked beans and deviled eggs, a nostalgic nod to a time when dessert could be bright green and still be taken seriously. Before imported jams and specialty nut butters lined grocery store shelves, home cooks relied on simple, homemade spreads to add flavor to bread and biscuits. Among them was fig and walnut spread, a smooth yet textured blend that offered natural sweetness with a bit of crunch. Though not as flashy as other church potluck staples, it was a reliable addition to the table, often served alongside cheeses or as a topping for warm cornbread. The method was straightforward yet timeless. Dried figs were simmered in water or fruit juice until soft, then mashed or pureed with honey or sugar. Chopped walnuts added texture, while a touch of lemon juice or a pinch of cinnamon brightened the flavor. Some versions leaned into the Mediterranean roots of figs, adding a drizzle of olive oil or even a splash of brandy. The result was a spread that was both rustic and refined, perfect for breakfast, tea time, or even as a filling for pastries. So why did it fade from church kitchens? The rise of store-bought jams and nut butters made homemade spreads seem unnecessary. Ice houses were a pretty integral part of how food preservation worked for the better part of several centuries. Before we had the dawn of mechanical refrigeration, this was pretty much the standard way of how to do things. There were a few reasons too, because the icehouse format had been reformed and refined until they hit a blueprint that ticked every box. The ice houses we've come to see having widespread use were built underground, with really thick walls that were reinforced with layers of stones and bricks, sometimes even wood. They'd also be layered with things like straw, sawdust, or peat moss, so that they'd be covered with insulators. The idea was to stop heat transferring. You know, insulation helps keep thermal conductivity low, so heat doesn't really get the chance to creep into the house. Plus, while nobody ever expected these ice houses to last forever, they had one benefit over fridges, kind of. If the power goes out, you're on a countdown until it comes back or your stuff spoils. In an ice house, thanks to a concept known as latent heat of fusion, ice houses would stay cool on the inside as the exterior would melt. This is because ice absorbs a large amount of heat while it melts. All of this, combined with the ventilation that would be built into these, would basically ensure that ice houses were as close to fridges as people were going to get for a long time. Braised lamb shanks with mint sauce are also something that have a particularly long history in America, and this time, it's with an Irish spin. Now, before we talk about what inspired this, let's talk a bit about the shank in general. This fine cut of meat has always been underappreciated since it came from the lower leg of the animal and was a lot tougher. It was something the wealthy class looked down upon because it was a dish you had to work for. You know, kind of like crabs. The more tender and soft meat was, the easier it was to eat, the more it would be associated with wealth. Lamb was also something that was really common in the 20th century throughout places like New England, where a farming culture really thrived. This rustic dish was a big part of the nose-to-tail style of eating, where families would devour every part of an animal in the name of not wasting a single bit of it. Personally, I think that's pretty considerate and respectful. How do you feel about it, though? While you type it out, let me tell you a bit more about braised lamb shanks. They fell out of fashion because, in general, people just didn't appreciate the gamey taste of lamb too much as time went on, but they were considered a big Sunday roast staple for people who were born in homes with farming-oriented lifestyles. In the world of potlucks and church picnics, The holy hogi dip was the kind of dish that sparked curiosity and kept people coming back for seconds. Inspired by the classic Italian hogi, this creamy dip combined diced deli meats like salami and ham, provolone cheese, crisp lettuce, tomatoes, onions, and zesty Italian dressing, all folded into a creamy mayonnaise base. Served with toasted baguette slices or crackers, it was essentially a hoagie deconstructed and ready to share. No messy sandwiches required. The dip's rise in popularity during the late 20th century mirrored America's love for Italian-inspired cuisine and the growing trend of turning traditional dishes into crowd-friendly dips. Its versatility made it a potluck superstar. Adjust the meats, toss in some hot peppers for spice, or lighten it up with low-fat ingredients. The options were endless. Plus, its no-cook preparation meant less time in the kitchen and more time enjoying the gathering. So why did it fade into obscurity? Part of the decline can be attributed to a cultural shift toward lighter, healthier fare. The cream-based dips of yesteryear gave way to hummus and veggie platters. Few aromas could fill a church kitchen quite like freshly baked dinner rolls. Soft, buttery, and served warm, these rolls were a symbol of homemade care and hospitality. Devotion dinner rolls were the kind of recipe passed down through families, often scrawled on flour-dusted recipe cards and perfected over decades of Sunday suppers and holiday feasts. Homemade bread has deep roots in American culinary history, long before mass-produced loaves became the norm. In the 1970s, scratch-made dinner rolls still held their place on church tables, reflecting a time when baking bread was both an act of love and a nod to tradition. With simple, affordable ingredients like flour, yeast, and butter, these rolls were versatile enough to accompany anything from soups to pot roast, making them a must-have at potlucks. So why are they now more a memory than a staple? Blame the rise of convenience foods. The introduction of prepackaged rolls and frozen bread dough offered busy cooks a shortcut that didn't involve kneading or proofing. And while nothing quite compares to the taste of homemade, time-consuming recipes often took a backseat as modern life sped up. So no one's a stranger to the process of larding, but I think a lot of us just follow these things because they're generational, tried and tested tips and tricks we know work. Why do they work, though? Well, if you've ever played FIFA or a Dragon Age game, then you know the concept of a defender or a tank. Lard kind of acts like that. It makes a protective barrier of fat, which melts away when you cook. But when you just coat it, it seals it from any outside exposure. This helps oxidation basically never happen, which means you don't get any nasty-smelling meat or spoilage. Meat needs to be juicy too, though. Fat helps keep a lot of that water and moisture in, because who likes their steak dry? Plus, did you know some organisms that spoil your stuff actually really just get off of air? Lard really helps choke them out. When we were living in colonial times and people were still immigrating to the South and West, larded meats were even a sign of luxury and were a big part of our culture. It was impossible to make those long treks without a supply of properly preserved and fresh meat. You know, guys back in the day used to hunt feral pigs and make wild boar shoulder roasts out of them. Nowadays, they listen to Andrew Tate. You gotta start wondering where we went wrong with everything. No, but really, wild boar shoulder roasts were a thing. And not only were they were a thing with a lot of historical and culinary reference. So basically, a super important thing. The dish was a heritage of regional cooking that blended the best and most practical parts of Southern and Native American influences. Wild boars aren't something that were native to America, and indigenous people were the ones who were the most proficient hunters. They were also the ones who did the most experimenting and found out that things like smoking and roasting work really well here. You might think, but if they aren't native, how come so many are there in the South? Well, that has to do with how boars were introduced by Spanish explorers in the 1500s. Basically, those boars had escaped into the southern side of the country, and that's why you see so many in the South. Wild boar became a sign of bounty and became associated with feasts, holidays, and eventually roasts. But we've really moved away from hunting as a country. Prayerful pasta Primmavera salad was one of these newcomers, combining tender pasta with fresh, crisp vegetables like bell peppers, cherry tomatoes, and zucchini. Tossed in a zesty Italian vinaigrette, this cold salad brought vibrant colors and refreshing flavors to any gathering, offering a welcome reprieve from heavier dishes. This salad excelled in versatility and practicality. It could be prepared a day ahead, allowing the flavors to meld together beautifully. And it traveled well, perfect for outdoor church picnics. The recipe was also flexible. Any combination of vegetables could be used, depending on what was in season or on hand. Even picky eaters could find something to enjoy in its customizable mix. Add a sprinkle of Parmesan, and it could easily transition from a simple side dish to a more filling option. So, why has it become a rarity? As pre-packaged pasta salads and pre-made dressings became widely available, the labor of chopping fresh vegetables and mixing homemade vinaigrettes seemed less appealing. Modern convenience overshadowed the care that went into making this dish. Sauerkraut is one of the most famous examples of Germans and Americans finding a perfect middle ground. It's one of those marriages of culture, flavors, and taste palettes that just manages to work for almost everyone. Back in the day, it was one of the biggest must-haves at potlucks, and regions with a strong European presence or active German communities couldn't get enough of it. Sauerkraut was known for two things. It was a roller coaster of different kinds of meats, cheeses, and potatoes. Two, it was filling, more than anything you could put in front of it for comparison. Two people on their own just weren't ever able to complete this casserole on their own. Lots of people think that it became such a crowd pleaser because of its roots as a dish made in rural areas. It was pretty much built to survive harsh winters. There's also the way it's really affordable. It takes basic things and simple crops to make one really good casserole that you can pretty much make whenever you would like. You can prepare the dish and put it in the fridge. You could transport that to wherever you're going, take it along with you and bake it there. You could also just bake it later, whenever you feel comfortable enough to. For lots of utility reasons, as well as a flavor profile you wouldn't find anywhere else, this German dish really made a name for itself here. On the other hand, pemmican is a traditional food developed by indigenous peoples of North America. They were a very ideal way to preserve meat, fat, and berries all in one for long-term storage, and it's probably one of the earliest examples we have of portable food that was put in a compact form because it needed to. It was ideal for travel, trading, and quick consumption, all factors that American industries and companies would keep in mind going forward. How does all this work, though? Bison, deer, and elk are all good sources of lean meat and were herded by indigenous peoples for a long time. All the meat from these animals would be dried, either through sun-drying it or through smoking it. In place of that, rendered fat like tallow would be mixed with the powdered dried meat, and this would seal the meat, preventing any air from interacting with it and excess moisture ruining the drying process. Berries also would contain acidic compounds and antioxidants that would help kill microbe activity overall and help reduce spoilage, and the final mix of this would be molded into cakes and balls and put into compact containers. If you made pemmican properly, it could actually last all year or even more than that, and it was packed with all kinds of nutrition that were important for a nomadic lifestyle. In short, this was a wonder food, and it was built to take care of everything you would need nutritionally. Rabbits and white wine sauce were a funny thing. Ideally, there's probably nothing more gourmet than being served something like this. A fancy European-style white wine sauce with a perfectly tender and juicy rabbit. It just sounds like rich people food, you know? Which is why I wonder if you'll be surprised when you find out that rabbits actually weren't all that expensive or luxurious to get. Nowadays, you can get away with passing a rabbit dish as a gourmet experience depending on the skill of the chef and the complexity of the dish. Back then, though, we were just talking about Sunday roasts. Arguably, cooking the white wine sauce was harder than the rabbit here. Still, the culture of eating rabbits is something that I think began in the Great Depression. People were so low on game, chicken, and just sources of meat that they began to hunt, and rabbits were one of the most abundant resources available. I think from there on, lots of people, especially hunter families in the South, rediscovered a newfound appreciation for rabbit and its soft, buttery flavors. In the post-war era, when convenience foods were revolutionizing the American kitchen, Angel's Ambrosia pie emerged as a sweet symbol of the times. This chilled, no-bake dessert combined fruit cocktail, shredded coconut, and marshmallows folded into a creamy base, all nestled in a graham cracker crust. It was inspired by Ambrosia salad, a classic Southern dish with roots in 19th century holiday traditions. But here, it was given a modern twist, easy to prepare and perfect for the church potluck circuit. Practicality was one of the pie's greatest strengths. With canned fruit cocktail and pre-made crusts widely available, the ingredients were budget-friendly and accessible. The recipe required no cooking, making it an ideal choice for busy homemakers balancing everything from Sunday school prep to feeding a family. Its versatility was another draw. The filling could be adjusted with fresh fruits, whipped cream, or even a splash of fruit juice to suit personal preferences. So, why did this dessert lose its spot on the picnic table? As palates evolved and fresh ingredients became more accessible, dishes relying on canned and processed components fell out of favor. The tasty meat pie isn't your average store-bought pie. We're talking about a savory masterpiece filled with delicious goodness. This used to be a classic at Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners back in the day before hash brown casseroles came to take the cake. But tasty meat pies had their own beauty. Imagine a flaky golden brown crust with a filling of seasoned ground meat, chopped vegetables like carrots and peas, and a rich, flavorful gravy. The origins of the meat pie have been traced back to the Neolithic period around 6000 BC. Yeah, even the Egyptians were a fan of this classic. It's perfect for a potluck, a family dinner, or even a cozy night in. The best part? Its portability. Just grab a slice and head out the door. It's the ultimate dinner on the go. In the days when nothing went to waste, a pot of slow-cooked beans with hog jowls and onions was a way of life. Rooted in Southern cooking traditions, this hearty meal was a staple at church potlucks and community gatherings. Pinto beans, rich in protein and fiber, were an affordable way to feed a crowd, while hog jowls, a cut from the cheek of the pig, added smoky, savory depth that transformed the humble legume into something extraordinary. Historically, this dish thrived in communities where resourcefulness was key. Hog jowls, often considered a byproduct, were a favorite in Southern cuisine, where the whole hog philosophy reigned supreme. Combined with onions and slow cooking, the result was a dish that was simple yet deeply flavorful. And let's not forget the practicality. Beans are inexpensive, shelf-stable, and could simmer all day while the cook tackled other tasks. But as modern tastes shifted, hog jowls fell out of favor. Health trends, coupled with the rise of leaner meats, left this dish behind in the dust of culinary history. Convenience foods like canned beans and pre-seasoned mixes didn't help either. Curing with nitrates has been another way of preserving meat. They did 3 things, and they did them really well. Those were preserving your meat's color, killing off any bacteria, and enhancing flavor. Pretty good all-rounder, right? Turns out, we used to deal with a pretty nasty illness known as botulism, which happened thanks to the rampant growth of Clostridium botulinum in meat. Lots to pronounce, but the gist of it is that this foodborne illness goes bye-bye when you cure meat with nitrates. Myoglobin in meat reacts with nitrates to overall just wipe out scores of bacteria. It's a real bloodbath if you look at it through a microscope, really. What's up with the color thing, though? Nitrates can actually help keep your ham, bacon, or whatever it is looking really vibrant and fresh, and that's all because it's a damn good curing agent. Oxidation is a real pain, and it can happen to you or any food you love. Nitrates have become so common now that we actually can't tell they enhance flavor anymore, but they do. Try having meat with none of that stuff put in. You'll immediately be able to tell the difference. It's because nitrites break nitric oxide down and form flavor compounds with amino acids in meat. This basically is what enhances its umami flavor and is something that industries keep trying to do to push certain flavor profiles forward. They're after you. Herb-stuffed guinea hens were another kind of meat that had an extremely fascinating history overall in America. They were something that was cherished by the population for how sustainable they were and the specific flavor of the meat, which would just work the best overall with roasting. It was a blend of African and rural American traditions that brought the best out of this dish. See, When I say African influences, I don't want to discredit the amount of work they actually put in here. Guinea hens were something that were always native to Africa, and when prisoners were brought on over thanks to the transatlantic slave trade, they brought on over along with them all of their cooking expertise. To them, guinea hens were a deep-rooted connection to their heritage. Can't say I blame them either. It's pretty human to find pieces of your home wherever you go, isn't it? Speaking of homes, lots of households actually dedicated themselves to farming and raised guinea hens. Now, besides the taste palette of America just changing a lot in the past few years, guinea hens have also not been the most popular farm animal in the past years, with more people investing in cattle thanks to beef production and how profitable that industry is. Thank you, McDonald's. The late 1980s and early 1990s brought a new wave of potluck stars to church picnics, and virtuous vegetable pizza squares quickly claimed a spot near the top. With a flaky crescent roll crust, a tangy ranch-seasoned cream cheese base, and a colorful array of diced fresh vegetables, this dish was as visually appealing as it was satisfying. It struck a balance between indulgence and health, offering a lighter option without sacrificing flavor, a rare feat on a picnic table laden with heavy casseroles and desserts. The practicality of this dish was a major reason for its popularity. The recipe was straightforward, the ingredients were affordable, and the end result could be made ahead of time and served cold. This made it perfect for picnics, where refrigeration wasn't always guaranteed. It was also highly customizable. Broccoli, carrots, peppers, or even a sprinkle of cheese allowed for personal touches, ensuring it could cater to nearly any palate. So, why did these savory squares fade into the background? Part of the reason lies in the rise of pre-packaged veggie trays and dips, which offered a quicker, less labor-intensive alternative. Additionally, the appeal of ranch-flavored dishes has waned over the years as food trends shifted. Braised lamb shanks with mint sauce are also something that have a particularly long history in America, and this time, it's with an Irish spin. Now, before we talk about what inspired this, let's talk a bit about the shank in general. This fine cut of meat has always been underappreciated since it came from the lower leg of the animal and was a lot tougher. It was something the wealthy class looked down upon because it was a dish you had to work for. You know, kind of like crabs. The more tender and soft meat was, the easier it was to eat, the more it would be associated with wealth. Lamb was also something that was really common in the 20th century throughout places like New England, where a farming culture really thrived. This rustic dish was a big part of the nose-to-tail style of eating, where families would devour every part of an animal in the name of not wasting a single bit of it. Personally, I think that's pretty considerate and respectful. How do you feel about it, though? While you type it out, let me tell you a bit more about braised lamb shanks. They fell out of fashion because, in general, people just didn't appreciate the gamey taste of lamb too much as time went on, but they were considered a big Sunday roast staple for people who were born in homes with farming-oriented lifestyles. So, putting your fruits in sugar to preserve them is an age-old trick that's been around forever. Are you interested in the know-how, though? Because it's actually a lot of neat little stuff working together to make sure you can get 1 or 2 days more out of that banana. So, first, we need to talk about a little something called osmotic pressure. Sugar tends to make an environment with a high amount of osmotic pressure, and this really draws water out of microbial cells, which includes things like bacteria and yeast. Microbes basically need their daily 8 glasses of water to live, or they'll die, and unlike us, they can't substitute that for a Coke and a cigarette. Sugar binds with molecules in water, and it robs those microorganisms of what they need to live. Pretty brutal, right? That's not sweet at all. I bet you didn't know how much sugar reduces it either, and your overall water activity actually goes below 0.85 plus. It also works as an antioxidant. What does that mean? Basically, the enzymes that are responsible for browning your fruit, ruining that perfectly ripe taste, sugar gets rid of that. All in all, it's your go-to solution for making your fruits last longer, look better, and taste fresher also? Just be cleaner overall. Really just a pit stop for your fruit basket. Some traditions die super hard though. Braised oxtail roast and oxtail in general is something you probably never will be able to separate from the African American community here at any point in time. Hey, it's not like other people don't enjoy it, but if you want your oxtail done right, authentic and exploding with flavor, you best go to a black mom. You might be wondering where the roots of all this stem from. Well, besides just how oxtail was given to slaves because it wasn't as desirable of a cut of meat as others, African American cuisine often takes on a lot of influence from West African culinary traditions too. Lots of dishes like egusi stew, for example, also feature bone-in cuts of meat. Braised oxtail roasts, on the other hand, were a stew that was just really hard to beat. After emancipation, most African American communities started to rely on oxtail a lot, and braised oxtail roasts became a key part of Sunday roast culture for a lot of families. It's still probably the most prevalent thing on the list today, at least for now. In the 1960s and 1970s, as convenience foods and chilled dishes grew in popularity, cold pasta salads became a staple at church picnics. Savior's shrimp pasta salad was one of the more elegant options, combining tender shrimp, crunchy celery, and a creamy dill dressing. Tossed with perfectly cooked pasta, it offered a sophisticated twist on the typical potluck fare, adding a touch of coastal charm to even the most landlocked gatherings. This salad excelled in versatility. It could be adapted to fit the occasion, with small tweaks like adding fresh herbs, chopped vegetables, or even a splash of lemon for brightness. Its creamy dill dressing was a crowd pleaser that complemented the sweetness of the shrimp and the subtle flavor of the pasta. The dish also traveled well, making it perfect for outdoor events where refrigeration might be minimal. So, why did this elegant creation fade from our tables? The answer lies in changing dietary habits and the growing availability of pre-made seafood salads in grocery stores. Over time, many home cooks opted for simpler, less time-consuming alternatives. Additionally, as food safety awareness increased, dishes featuring seafood became less common at room temperature events. Cucumber canapés, on the other hand, are something else entirely. This time around, you can definitely tell where they came from. Just a quick look at their history will point you right to 18th century France, where a canapé was the new trend in town. Fast forward just a little bit to when the first French and European immigrants started coming around to America, and you'll figure out that they actually brought this recipe over with them. Why was this something that did well, though? If you've ever heard of the 1960s, you'll hear the phrase health consciousness thrown around a lot. There was a good reason for that too, but the seeds of all the vegetable-heavy dieting shifts of the later decades were sown during this time. There was a small but progressively louder community of concerned parents and doctors who were voicing their opinions. They firmly believed American diets were bad, just flat-out bad for you. The best thing to do then was to eat greener, and what says green and clean like a cucumber? Okay, corny metaphors aside, it really did help make a gradual and daily shift towards better eating habits. A canapé itself was just a series of small bites with lots of different bread and cracker toppings, but this puff pastry ended up being just what people needed. Looks like we're going to be dealing with some millennia-old classics for a while. Sprouting grains is probably older than the last two combined, and it basically works as a steroid for your grains. You soak, germinate, and sprout the grains, and this does a lot for them. It activates enzymes like amylase and protease, and then they break down complex carbs, fats, and proteins. Not sure what all that means? Basically, you turn on the things that help break your food down and turn it a lot more digestible. Naturally, germination also has been known to make the vitamins that are already there in fruits even more effective. Vitamins B and C get the highest effect out of this, though the science on that one is lost to me too. Not only was sprouting grains a big idea during colonial America, but it was something that became a mainstream practice during the Great Depression and War era thanks to the way people were sharing any and all information, including long-held family traditions just to survive another day and keep their pantry going. Now, Swiss steak is like a warm hug from the past. This dish is all about slow-cooked, fall-apart tender beef bathed in a tangy tomato sauce. Think slow cooker vibes, but way before slow cookers were even a thing. Now, the Swiss steak is all about patience. The longer you simmer the beef, the more melt in your mouth delicious it becomes. It's also the perfect way to use up that tougher cut of meat you accidentally grabbed at the store. If you grew up thinking this dish was from Switzerland, as the name suggests, now would be a good time for me to tell you your whole life was a lie. This technique of cooking up tender meat came from England, so they're the ones to thank for this meaty goodness. I can just imagine the satisfying experience of cutting through that tender beef with minimal effort. Swiss steak, a dinnertime classic that deserves a comeback. Where do I sign the petition? If you enjoyed this nostalgic video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments if your church ever made any of these dishes back in the day.